Welcome to JMeter tutorial. So today we will see logical controllers with practicals also. So I have developed a few scripts to understand how actually logical controllers work. So before moving to the practical session, we'll see and go through the theoretical part of logical controller. First of all, what is logical controller? So logical controllers defines the order, how and when the samplers will be executing under a test plan. So it lets you control when to send a request and how to send it. So it determines the order in which the script is going to execute and which of the sampler will be executing and how many times. So to add logical controller, you need to go to the thread group, right click on thread group, then hover on add, then logical controller, and then the controller which you want to select. So as you can see on my screen, it is add, then hovering on add, it will be logic controller. Inside logical controller, there will be different types of controller. We'll see different kinds of controller in that part of the tutorial. So moving on. First is critical section controller. So this is a new controller which has been added to JMeter. So it actually ensures that elements of this controller are accessed by one thread at a time. That if there are multiple threads executing the script, that is inside your web test plan, there are multiple thread users, and if you want to ensure a particular section should be executed once at a time from a JMeter, which can't be done on the parallel basis. So suppose there is an example. So suppose there is a particular section which is hitting the database and updating some of the tables. So these are the critical section because inside one table it cannot have multiple update at same time. So in these kind of scenario, we use critical section controller, where there is kind of lock kind of thing on the application logic level. So those things will be taken care by critical section controller. Then we have for each controller. So it depends upon the object level. So for a particular object, if you want to ensure that a particular request is been hit multiple times, then we will use for each controller. So we'll see in the practical session more of it. Then we have if controller. So if you have any particular uh, logic or any particular condition where you want to, once it is only satisfied, then only you want to execute a particular section, then you need to ensure that those sections would be under if controller. So whenever it is true, that particular section will be executed, or else it will not be executed. After that, we have include controller. So include controller mainly used for modularization of your script to reuse a particular section. And after that, we have interleave controller. So interleave controller is something where you want to actually execute a particular request only once during multiple iteration. For example, if we have 3 samplers added as a child in a particular controller, that is interleave controller, then in the first iteration it will pick the first sampler, and in the next iteration it will take the second one, and so on. So next is loop controller. So loop controller is nothing but it is if you want to execute a particular section multiple times, not the whole thread, then you need to make sure that those requests will be under loop controller. Module controller. Module controller is basically used for reusing a particular section which you have already developed in some kind of different script. Then you can use module controller. Once only controller is used in situation where you would like to perform an operation only once, even there are multiple iterations are going on. Next is a random controller. So uh, it is similar to interleave controller. The only thing is in interleave controller the execution will be sequential, but in random controller it will take actually the samples on the random basis. Then we have random order controller. So if you want to actually execute a particular section randomly, so you will push it in the random order controller. So there is a difference between random controller and random order controller, which is very important because in random controller only one of the samples will be executed in one iteration, but in random order controller all of the all of the whole section will be executed but in random fashion. Recording controller will be used at the time of recording, which we have seen in the uh, where we actually saw the recording of a web test plan in the previous section of the sessions. So next is runtime controller. So it is something we can limit time of execution for a particular section. So if you want to execute a particular section for a certain amount of time, you can mention it in runtime controller. So it will be independent of the time mentioned in the thread group level. Simple controller, it is just a placeholder for a particular section, and there is nothing logic into this. You just are mentioning a placeholder for a particular request or a set of requests. Switch controller is used, that is on depending upon the value of an object, just like we have in other programming language. We have switch control like we have in Java and C. So we can actually define switch controller in JMeter as well. Throughput controller. Throughput controller is actually used to control the processing, so that if we want to actually ensure that certain percentage of hits will be going to certain requests, then we need to mention the throughput controller. And next is transaction controller. So transaction controller actually is a placeholder where it will actually take all the requests, and while executing the test it will combine the response time of all the requests placed in the transaction controller. Suppose, just for an example, suppose there is a transaction called login. So suppose in a particular application for a particular function, suppose in login there are multiple calls will be going on. So suppose there are 3 to 4 calls, and if we want to check how much time actually it is taking for the whole functionality, that is for login functionality, then we should ensure that all those requests will be placed under transaction controller, and at the time of execution we'll check how much time actually took on a combined basis for all the requests for the total transaction. So while then next is while controller. While controller will be used to run the child elements until a particular logical like a particular logical scenario is ensured. That is, for a particular criteria, if it is coming as true, it will execute all those samples until that amount of time. So this is all about the theoretical sections. So now we will go ahead with the practical sessions. So first we need to go to the JMeter and we'll see what are the different kind of controllers over there.
This conference will now be recorded.
So now this is actually the script which I have developed for to understand how actually the logical controller works. So in the group we have first is if controller. So as we saw in the previous sections of the sessions that we have a very simple script where there are just the two calls. That is, first is the launch URL and another is the find flights. So to ensure that we understand controllers, we are just going for the very simple script so that we can in the near future if there are any complex script we can utilize this knowledge to develop our script. So first set group is for if controller. So this is my first sampler, that is launch URL, and then we have find flights. As you can see, this is the if controller. You can give a meaningful name. This is the search criteria or the logical criteria where we are ensuring that it should execute. So I'm removing everything what I have executed earlier. So see, all these things are disabled right now, so it will not execute these things. It will just execute the if controller one. So looking at the number of users, I've given 3 users. It is taking data from the CSV file mentioned over here. So there are two variable name, that is from and to port, which we are passing it in the find flights. So the search criteria or the logical criteria is that if p from port is wrong, then only execute this part, that is find flight. So we'll see in the data sheet. So in data sheet we have, so in yeah, let me just, yeah. So in data sheet we have first value as Paris, second is VA, some random value, then third is Rome. So and we are executing it for 3 threads. So first thread will pick up the first value, that is Paris, second will take as VA, and third will take Rome. So ideally it should execute the second transaction just once. So I'm executing right now. You can see that launch URL has been hit 3 times, but find flights it is only just once because from port is Rome. So this is how actually if controller works. It satisfied the condition just once, that's why it has executed just one time. So if I change the value of second one as Rome again, so ideally it should work for 2 times. So now I am actually giving the name P2 port as this, and then I'm removing everything. Just check how many times it is executed. So see, find flights has been executed twice because the condition is meeting 2 times. So moving on to the next controller, we have for each controller. So for each controller, we are using the regular expression extractor, and we have mentioned as -1, that is for the or whatever the different kind of values are coming in a particular regular expression, all those things will be placed inside this variable and it will be taken as an array, and we are passing that value p from port over here, and we are using it as our in the second sample we are using that value as a parameter. So you see that we are capturing the value in the p from port variable, which will be an array, and inside the for each controller we are taking input as that array and output variable as p from port. That is a different variable which we'll be using in this second sampler as a from port search criteria. So we'll see how many times it is executing. I've placed one debug sampler also so that we will understand what are the variable values we are getting. So moving on, I'm executing this one, and the execution is for just for one thread. So I'm hitting it. I'm removing everything from the view result tree. I'm adding one more listener, that is aggregate report, to understand how many times the samples were hit. So I'm executing now. So see, this find flights is going to execute multiple times. What? Until we have value in the p from port variable. So if you see in the aggregate report, it has been executed 14 times. Find flight, because this regular expression, if you see in the, if you want to check how many times it has been executed, go to the view result tree. We are capturing in this request, then select regular expression extractor and pass the regular expression and check how many values are coming. If you see that there are total 14 values it is coming. Even if you see in the debug sampler what are the different values it captured. So see, so first is London, sorry, first one is Paris, and we have so on different 14 values. If you check in the here in the request itself, so first one is Paris, second Philadelphia, Boston, and so on. If we verify in the debug sampler the variable names, see, first one is Paris, second one should be Philadelphia. Where is the second one? Yeah, so this one is Philadelphia. So in this way the for each controller will work. So it depends upon the number of matched regular expression variables, the value it will match, and it will take all those values into the array, which in the form of array in this particular variable, that is p from port, and during the execution of the for each controller it will pass that value one at a time in the variable name which we have mentioned in the output variable name. So this is all about the for each controller, how it works. We are disabling this one and we are moving on to the transaction controller. So this is so as we discussed in the theoretical part, that what is transaction controller is, it will actually combine the response time of all the samplers or requests mentioned in the transaction controller. So I have taken a transaction controller named find flights. In that particular transaction controller only, I have placed both the requests. If we run it now, then we will understand how actually it works. So see, now launch URL, it is taking 477 milliseconds, and find flights is taking 171 milliseconds. So as you can see in the transaction controller, sample is one, that is fine, but the average is combining to the both. So in this way it works. If we run it for multiple times, so suppose if I'm running it for 3 times, so now see what will happen. Now check the average. As we have run it multiple times, the average that is showing as different as we have seen in the previous example, but still it is combining the both the attributes of both the samplers. So this is all about transaction controller. It helps a lot to understand for a particular functionality how much time it took during the load test execution. So now next we have loop controller. So in loop controller, see, on the thread group level we have mentioned loop count as only one. So ideally if we have not using any controller, both the requests should be running just for once. But as we have mentioned in the loop controller, for this find flight it should executed as 4 times. So we'll see, I'm removing everything now. I'm executing now. See, the find flights is being executed 4 times because it has been actually placed in loop controller and the value is mentioned as 4. If you see in the aggregate report also, find flights is executed 4 times, but launcher is just executed once. So this is how it works for loop controller. Now next we are going to while controller. So as we discussed in the theoretical section, that the while controller will check for a particular condition. Until that met, it will execute whatever is placed inside that particular transaction, or inside the while controller. So in this script we have just a find flight. One of the request has been placed in the while controller and we'll check how many times it is executing. So it is executing once because we have to check in our, so what we have mentioned is P from port. So we need to check. Yeah, so P from port is, so it will check for the first value. The first value is Paris. It should not execute this one. We'll execute it for 3 times and we'll see how much time it is actually being hit. See, launch URL is coming 1, 2, 3 times, but find flights is coming just twice because it is taking the value Rome twice. As the criteria has been matched just 2 times, that's why it is executing this particular section twice in 3 loop iteration. So this is about while controller. So it takes a particular condition. Until that condition is met, it will execute that particular section. So now next is a random controller. So before understanding random controller, we have seen in the theoretical section what is random controller is. So random controller will take the so suppose if you want to execute a particular script multiple times for multiple user, for the section which has been mentioned in the random controller, it will execute one of the requests inside the controller just once in each iteration. So we'll check. So to see that, we have actually taken 3 thread groups which will be running once. So we'll see how many times and what are the different samplers are being executed. See, this one is the first iteration, launch URL is being hit thrice, but as you can see in the random controller, we have 6 different URLs we are hitting, but it has been executed just once, and every time the sample was different. So first time it was the third one, and in the second iteration it was the last sample which was hit, and in the third it was the second sample it was hit. So it is completely random. If I increase it, suppose if I want to execute it 5 times, that is 3 into 5 is 15 times it will be executing. We will check how many times is being hit. So I'm adding one aggregate report into that to check. See, as you can see, the launch URL is hitting 5 times. First sample is being hit 4 times, 6 is 3 times, and so on. So all those are hit, but the number of samples are totally different. So this is how actually random controller works. It will execute one sample at a time for each iteration, but randomly. It will take each request at a time for different iteration, but that too in random fashion. So next is random order controller. So in random controller, we have seen that it will execute one sample at a time. But in random order controller, it will execute all of the samples, but in random fashion for each iteration. So there is a difference that for random order, it will take one samples at a time, but in random order controller, it will take all the samplers, but the execution will be in random fashion for each iteration. So I'm executing it just for once, for one iteration, for one user. We'll see if all the, yeah, so you can see that this is the first sample that is outside of the random order controller. So ideally the sequence should be 1, 2, 3, 5, 6, and 7, but as we have mentioned these samplers in random order controller, that's why it is being executed randomly. That is, first one is 7, then 6, then 3, then 2, and so on. So this is the difference between random order and random controller. So now we are going to see throughput controller. It is a very important controller because you can actually define for a particular section how many times it should run. It's like what percentage it should be running. So suppose we have a scenario like we will take an example of Amazon or Flipkart, where if you see logically the time most of the time and the most of the transaction which will be performed on the Amazon or Flipkart kind of website is the search one, where we are searching the product. So this will be the volume of this particular transaction should be highest. So in this way we have contact us section or different section which will be the volume will be very minimum. So depending upon that we need to define our workload model, and depending upon that workload model we need to define our scripts also. So suppose I have one particular workload model where for the total transaction for a particular section it should be only executed 50% time. So suppose this is my 50%, and again for a particular throughput, if I am taking it, I am minimizing the number of transactions right now. So I'm giving it 25%, 25. I'm mentioning over here as 25%. Now I'm removing the first 4. So we'll see how actually it will work. So I'm executing it for 4 threads, and I have mentioned for the first throughput controller 50% of the transaction should go into first transaction controller, sorry, the throughput controller, and then for the next throughput controller I mentioned as 25%. So this is our distribution, that for all the users launch URL will be 100%, means all the whatever hits are going all for all the users. First sample should be hit for each and every user, and find flights underscore 1 and 2 should be executed for 50% of the user, and third criteria is that find flights underscore 5 and 6 should be executed for 25% of the user. So To make it easier, I have taken a even number, that is 4. So ideally, how it should work is launch URL should be executed 4 times. The sampler which are mentioned in throughput controller 50% should be executed twice for 2 users, and throughput controller 25% should be executed for 1 user. So I am going to add one sampler listener to this particular thread, that is aggregate report, so that we can understand how many times these different samples were hit. So see, for the launch URL, it is ideally it should be 100%. That is, for each user it has been executed once. We had 4 users mentioned in the thread group. That's why it is 4 over here. Then for flight 1, as it is in the first throughput controller, that is 50%. That's why it has been executed twice. And similarly, for 5 and 6, it has been mentioned in the 25% throughput controller. That's why it has been executed just once. So this is actually very important controller which will help you to define your script depending upon your workload model. This is a very actually simple script, that's why it is we are not able to understand how important it is, but once we are going to see for more complex script, then we will understand how much throughput controller is helpful. Now, module controller. So as we saw in the theoretical part, that module controller will be used for a reusable section to execute. Suppose there is a scenario where for different scripts, one of the section is being used multiple times. So suppose login is a transaction which will be used multiple times for different scripts or different functionality. So ideally, how it should be like, it should be developed once and it should be reused in different scripts. So to achieve that, we will be using module controller. So as you can see, the first launch URL is which we are actually hitting on the to launching the page. And for module controller, just to make you understand, I have mentioned the whatever is there in the if controller. That is the thread group contains if the first one. So I have added a module controller and I have actually mentioned the you need to select which one you want to actually modularized. Okay, so in this way it works. So I have selected from the first thread group, that is thread group -if. So whatever functionality is there in that particular thread, ideally it should come over here. So I'm going to execute this one. I'm removing everything. So it will be running same as we saw in the if controller thread group. This is how actually module controller will work. It is just to make sure that you reuse your different fragments of your scripts which are actually common in different functionality. Yeah, so next is once only controller. So once only controller will be executing one of the so suppose there are multiple iteration, you are running it for particular functionality, but there is a scenario that one particular section should be executed just once, even if there are multiple iteration among that. So suppose this is actually by minimizing the number of transactions or the sampler just to make you understand how it works. So in this particular script we have 3 calls, and that is first one is the launch, second is the find flights which is mentioned in the once only controller, and we have find flight 7 which is outside of once only controller. So according to the once only controller definition, if we execute it for multiple times, so I mention as for one, I'm running it for 3 times for one user. So there are 3 iterations. So if we don't use any controller, all of these samplers should be executed thrice. But as we are running it through once only controller, we'll see how it will go. Moving ahead, I'm executing this part. So see, launch URL is executed thrice, that is expected. 7 is also executed thrice, that is also expected. But the transactions or the samplers mentioned in the once only controller is executed just once. So this is also expected because as per the definition of once only controller, if we want to run a particular section just once, even on the thread group level, the whole script should be running multiple times, that is for multiple iteration, then we should mention in the once only controller. That's what we are seeing over here also. Yeah, so next is interleave controller. It is similar to random controller. The only difference is in the random controller, the execution for a particular section will be, it will take one sample at a time randomly, but in interleave section or interleave controller, it will take the samples from a particular section mentioned in the interleave controller sequentially. So we'll see the difference now. I'm removing everything. See, so I have executed thrice. So here you can see that in first it took findLight _1, then 2, then 3. So now what I'll do is, just to make you understand, I'll disable this part. I'll go again to random controller and I'll run it for one user thrice, and we'll see if similar thing is coming or not. Launcher is fine. Then the first iteration it hit _3. Second one, it actually hit the first sampler, and in the third it hit 7th one. So this is the difference between random and interleave. So there is a similarity that it will take one sample at a time, but in interleave it will take the sample sequentially, but in random controller it will take one sample at a time randomly for each iteration. The last is critical section controller. So as we discussed in the theoretical section, that if you want to actually make sure that a particular section should be executed for each thread one at a time. It's like for one thread, if one of the thread is executing a particular section, let it finish that, then only it will pass on to the next thread. So to make us understand, what we have did is, we have taken the same example. There are 3 samples. First one is the launch URL, second is the first sample which we have actually mentioned in the critical section controller, and last one is the find flights. So ideally how it should be if we don't use any critical section is that first launch URL will be hit, then the find flights _1 should be hit, and then find flight 7 should be hit. So if we run it, let's see what will happen. We are running it for 2 threads, and iteration is, that is the loop count is 1, that it will execute twice each of the request. See, launch URL hit, then launch URL 2 is hit, then critical section hit, then find flight 7 hit. Then actually once the first iteration was over for that particular section, then only it move to the second V user, that is thread group. So this is how actually critical section is being used. There is one more controller which we are missing now, so I am going to add that one. That is, let's see which one is that. Yeah, runtime controller. So I am mentioning this thing. So runtime, I am giving it as 10 second. I'm mentioning it as runtime. This done. This done. I'm running it for one user. It will be running for 100 seconds. Let's see what happens. Launch your let, one let. As you can see that the sampler which we have mentioned in runtime controller is running for 10 seconds. So if we see, we are going to actually run it for 3 iterations, then we will understand this. So this is our first iteration. So in first iteration, we are actually running find flights underscore 1 as for 10 seconds. We'll add one more listener to understand this. So listener, your resultant table. See, it started on 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20. So it went until 24, and then the third sampler was hit. So again, this for the second iteration, first flight was hit at 25, 55, 25. Then it went until 35. Then the third iteration, sorry, third sample was hit. So whatever you are mentioning in the runtime controller, that particular section will be executed for these amount of time which you have mentioned in the runtime as seconds. So this is all about the different logical controllers which we have actually seen. So it gives a power to the script enhancement, and so that it will be more modularized, more of a logical thing. And if you want to combine all of your functionality into one script, controllers will help you a lot. And to define a particular workload model, which you have mentioned in your test plan or something, and to achieve that particular distribution, the logical controllers are very effective and should be used every time. So this is all about controllers. So moving on, we are actually going to sign off right now, and we'll see for the latter part of tutorial what we are actually going to check. Thank you.